Hello, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Inside Out podcast. This is your host, Suba Daud, and I hope all of our listeners are doing well. Today's an exciting day as we start our podcast journey, and I'm really excited to tell you all about it. But before we get into all the details about it, let me introduce you to a remarkable person who will be joining me in this endeavor. She's not only my co host, but she's also an expert in the field of psychology, behavioral therapy, autism, and family support. Her experience of spanning over 15 years has led to the start of the podcast. She's not only a professional, but also a visionary. Let me introduce you to Dr. Alia. Hi, Dr. Alia. How are you today?
Hi, Tuba. Thank you for that very nice and flattering introduction.
You're welcome. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about yourself and your background, where you come from?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity because you will be actually, part of why we created this podcast and part of this change we are aiming to create in the society, whether it's on an individual basis or a more like of a community basis. But I'll get to that later. I'll just speak a little bit about myself first. So as you have already introduced me with a little bit of more detail, I am Dr. Alia, and I am an expert in actually quite lots of fields. So it's a bit of mix between psychology, education, and autism, if we want to specify it to educational. But also, I do have lots of experience as well in working with schools, inclusive education, creating inclusive settings for children specifically, working with early intervention, behavioral therapy, so including ABA approaches and including, of course, family support approaches. But because I don't want to just, bind myself or limit myself to that specific field, because we will actually be talking about a lot of other things like mental health and counseling and so on. So I'll also explain a bit about my background in that. So the background here is if you want to put it in two different sections, so it's the educational, inclusive, where we have the other one, which is the psychological, mental health and counseling. So both of those fields or domains of my work or background have actually helped me a lot in creating not only an inclusive environment for children with special needs, but also to link those two together. And this is what we'll really be trying to do in our podcast, because oftentimes we look at education as one thing and mental health as another thing. But the idea is that, we don't really have that synthesis. We don't really have much of this combined understanding. So this is really what we'll be trying to talk about and what we'll be trying to really focus and highlight on in our podcast. And I'm not really the type to like to talk about myself in terms of like my background, my expertise, but just to give our listeners kind of an understanding of what they'll be expecting in our podcast, I need to just explain that whole, background. So this is in very short my background, but of course, throughout our different sessions on the different podcasts, our listeners will, of course, know more about that and understand more about that. And more importantly, they will benefit from that. It's not really important of my own background and what I do. What's important is how this is going to reflect and benefit our listeners.
That's true. I agree with you. I know, but our listeners do not know, but you are the owner and the founder of the Swedish Specialized Center for Special Needs. So, what inspired you to start that center? And like you mentioned, you have a diverse experience of working in education. So, what led you towards exploring that passion?
It's actually a really good question because I started this center very, very young, I would say. I mean, compared to the people around me, I was 24 at that age when I opened that center.
Whoa!
Yeah, it was, look, at that time I didn't feel very young, but now I'm looking back, I said, oh, that was quite young. So I did move to Egypt because, our family had to move back to Egypt. I never actually lived in Egypt before. I'm born and raised in Sweden. So the idea is that, it was a very big shift and just a big change for me. So moving to Egypt in 2012, this is when I actually opened SSC for special needs. And it was established first in Egypt. We stayed working there for about 7 years, and then we moved it to the UAE. But just to go back to how it all started is that I started off working as an ABA therapist, working with children with autism and special needs in general, specifically working with their families. And one thing that really inspired me to do this is the lack of actual available support services in Egypt in that specific field. Now, if you look at this specific year, like 2023, you'll find, of course, many more support centers, clinics, hospitals, and so on that will support children of determination. But at that time, really, there was not much. And that was really pushed me. And also having that background in not just in psychology and therapy, but I also was very interested in business psychology. So I did read a lot on that. And that was kind of like the combination of, how those two came together, like my passion for business and understanding like HR, understanding management, understanding finance, and understanding all the like business related aspects. It came and it kind of merged together with psychology. So I think it was a great opportunity for me to practice both of those. But also, I mean, I've never actually worked in business psychology. It was just my own personal passion. But it came together quite well because the center grew very fast, of course, as an outcome of that success, because we not only had a good therapy system in terms of how we help kids and how we support families, but it was also a very structured like center in terms of like organization wise. Of course, it took us a lot of trial and errors, a lot of experience, a lot of people going and coming. But in the end, we did what we wanted to do, and our vision was actually to help as many children as possible, of course, in their families, because whenever we talk about the child, we always talk about the family that comes with it. It's not just the child on their own. So what we did is actually I can't even remember the numbers was very big, hundreds of families that we and I'm not going to say we treated or we cured, but we actually supported, okay? Meaning supported that they went into schools, they were able to communicate with their families, they were able to live I would say functional lives, because we all know that autism, ADHD, and whatever like developmental delays, there's no treatment or cure to it. I don't like to say the word treatment. It's more of like how we support them to adapt to the society, and that's what we ultimately did. We I think we were very successful in that. I had a great team. I had a great team of therapists and a great team of admin staff, and it was time to kind of move that back to the UAE, because I love the UAE, and this is actually where I consider my home. So even though it was going very well in Egypt, I said no, it's time to come back to the UAE. So I did come back here and switch that, whole model. And when we came and moved back to the UAE, we worked with a very, very different approach. So the approach was not a typical, we had the child, we work on an ABA session and so on. Learning from I'm not going to say my mistakes, but my experiences in that clinical setting, we moved away to a more family-based approach. So what we started doing is working with children through their families, not just having a therapist and having a child. So what we started doing is ultimately like training the families. And you will find lots of like training programs for families saying like, okay, we train, but most of them are really theoretical. Okay, so what we did is we do 70% practice and 30% theory. So of course it is important that families do understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, and that's why we do the theoretical part. But the practice was actually what really also again thankfully created this success, because we have again families that we work with here in the UAE specifically that are doing great. And I say the families are doing great, not the children. Okay, the children, if the family is doing great, the children will be doing great, because they will of course reflect on the child. So that's kind of like the backstory of how this all happened.
I really liked what you said. You didn't use the word mistakes, but said experiences. And I think that's very important. And I think that's what a podcast will also tackle inside out. There's a hidden meaning, guys. But like
Yes.
you mentioned, you lived in Sweden, then you moved to Egypt, and now you're in the UAE. How was that dynamic, from to west to east? How did the dynamic change you as personally and professionally? What did you see in the workplace there that inspired you? Like, yeah, the Middle East needs that.
Well, that's actually a question that I am asked very often. What made you come from Sweden to this side of the world? And being from an Egyptian origins, I always had that. I was raised with Egyptian parents, so they of course reflected those Egyptian like traditions and cultures and norms on me. So I did still understand it, but of course, being raised in Sweden and then coming to the UAE and then going to Egypt and back and forth, this was culture shock, culture shock, culture shock. Okay, of course that was the case, and I think a lot of third culture kids can relate to that as well. But the idea is, if you go back to the experiences and how I learned is that, I took what I always say I take both best of both worlds. So what works in Sweden, and I take that with me. So if it's not working in Egypt, let's see how it works there. Because if it's working there and it's not existing in Egypt, this is how we can make things like, those gaps that we have. This is how we can bridge the gap. This is how we can help people who don't have those services yet, or those even that knowledge or like that awareness. Same thing with here. I would say the UAE is a very, very developed country in relation to the other countries in the Middle East. So I didn't have a very big gap as I had in Egypt, but still there were differences, and there were things that I learned from not only this in Sweden, but I learned from UAE and I took it with me to Egypt and then so back and so forth. So what I did was also take experiences from Egypt back to the UAE. But it was not the
Mhm.
experiences, like you said, in terms of like therapy, because of course it was not as evolved, but it was the experiences of management, people, interacting with different types of backgrounds, cultures, religions, and languages. And I took that with me to the UAE, specifically knowing that UAE is a very multinational country. We have so many nationalities and differences. So so just to answer your question in short, it was a very big, a huge mix of a lot of things. Because in addition to that, I also studied in the UK. So it was like an additional layer of other things as well. I did my PhD in Scotland and my master's in England. So it was also again a bit of mix there. So I could say I'm very blessed and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to have such diverse experiences. And that's why I say, it's not a mistake. You learn from your experience, not your mistake. There is a very popular saying you either sometimes you lose and sometimes you learn. Okay, you don't you sorry, sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. That's the right word. So you don't lose because even that loss is a learning journey. So that's how I see it. And I think that's what makes us as a center, the same ideas that I always try to also I would say infect my team members with.
That's very nice. I really like the fact that you have had such diverse experiences because I think that diversity added towards your passion, your dedication in improving the services as you moved forward, like from Sweden, then to the UK, then Egypt, and now UAE. So definitely, I feel like exposing yourself to different cultures and different realms of life is very, very important. So now, since we're talking about exposure and differences and diversity, this is what I feel like we're bringing to the podcast. We'll be talking about a range of topics from family support, mental health, autism, workplace issue, body image. It's so diverse that I feel like our listeners will get a very well-rounded approach. So, Dr. Alia, now you are also aware of what the podcast is going to bring to the table. What makes a podcast so different? And because there's so many podcasts out there's so many psychology podcasts in the market, so what makes us different that people should add us to their playlist?
Well, I'm going to go back to the same kind of idea that I mentioned at the very beginning of that combination, that synthesis, because a lot of psychology podcasts, they're great, and I'm personally following a lot of them, and they will have, lots of insights on like, how to change your mindset, how to live a better life in general, how to be more mindful, and so on. Now, all of those are out there, right? But like you said, what makes us diverse is that we are really combining and I'm gonna say a lot of my personal experience is gonna come into this, not just my personal experiences, but my experience as in like different cultures, different dealing with different nationalities, having this diverse background. I think this is what gonna make us very unique in that sense because we're not only gonna be speaking to, let's say, people listening in the US or people listening in India or people listening in Egypt. We're going to be speaking really to everybody, and this is going to be really applied to everybody. So as much as we like to talk about like a specific country or a specific, culture, we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about whatever can really fit to everyone. It's not going to be specific to a certain country or culture, but also we're going to combine a lot of educational practices with the psychological practices. And even if, a lot of people are going to say, well, I don't have kids, like, I don't need the educational practices or this doesn't concern me. But actually it does concern you because you are part of our whole society, our whole community. And why we came up with this name Inside Out is because we are going inside. Okay, we are going inside. We are looking inside. We are looking into our thoughts. We're looking into our feelings, emotions, and how we can manage those better. But we are also looking outside. We're looking what are the things in our community that we need to work on? What are the things that we need to improve? Now, a lot of people are going to say, why are you assuming we need to improve? We can always improve. Okay, there is never a time where we cannot improve. We're not perfect, not as a community, not as a society, not as humans. Okay, so we can always improve. And when I say improve, considering my background in special needs as well, I'm also talking a lot about inclusive practices. How can we make the world a better place for people who have special needs, people who are not? Now we say neurodivergent because they don't. And when I say special need, I'm talking even about, let's say, gifted students. Now, I'm not talking about disabilities only. I'm talking about gifted students who are in classrooms, for example, but they
Mm.
are not challenged enough. They are not reaching their full potential because we as educators don't have enough knowledge. So actually our podcast is going to be covering a lot of diverse topics on education, on parenting, on mental health, on just friendships, on mindset, self-confidence. It's very, very diverse. It's not going to only be focusing on one specific aspect, which is more like, the typical, like, oh, you need to get up and create a habit for yourself, and time management. It's not going to be those typical things. And it's going to be very hands-on because I am a very pragmatic person. Even though, I am now in academia and teaching as an assistant professor, I have that, background on research and theory, but still I like to keep things very practical. So all the advice I'll be giving, it will be very practical. So if I say something like, oh, well, we need to change our mindset. Now we all know we do, but what do I need to do? Where are the tools? What do I do with this information? So this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be giving practical solutions, practical activities, practical things that you can do with your husband, with your friends, with your, close family members, with your children, with your professor in university, whoever it is going to be very general to everybody to relate to. That's how we're going to be different from the rest of the podcasts.
And like you mentioned, when anyone has a question regarding, like, like you said, you'll give practical solutions or like practical advices. So if someone has, we release a podcast episode and someone has a question, okay, how, I have a question regarding dealing with my professor, how can I do it? How would you approach that, even though the podcast has been recorded?
Well, actually, we're going to be posting, of course, our podcasts on our social media channels. And I want everybody listening right now, prepare any possible questions that you have, whatever it's about. Of course, if it's related to education, psychology, mental health, whatever it is, prepare them, and they can just comment questions on our post, on the actual podcast, and we're going to definitely be addressing that in our next podcast. And also, for those who are really interested in kind of engaging live, we will also be having some live discussion, so it will not all be recorded, so they will have an opportunity also to discuss kind of like, in person, if you want to call it that. Okay, but live, so just instead of having to watch just recorded, they will have opportunities as well to do this live.
And will we have guest speakers, some guest experts from, let's say, academia or different areas of psychology that people can get excited to look forward to?
Yes, for sure. And again, it's all about what the audience wants, right? So if everybody says, oh, we'd really like to hear from, let's say, a clinical psychologist, or somebody who is in the field of forensic psychology, or somebody who's in the field of disability studies, whatever it is, we will definitely try to arrange for that, because the podcast is not just for the purpose of me speaking about everything, but we want to, like you said, we want to make it diverse, and we want people to have specific opportunities to ask about, experts in the fields.
And I really hope, like, this podcast, people can get the support that they need from it. And again, like Dr. Alia mentioned, do reach us with all your questions. If you have any stories to share, or you guys want us to talk about a certain topic, let us know and we'll prepare you the best episode you could have ever imagined. But so any final thoughts, Dr. Alia, about the new journey that we're going to embark on soon?
Well, I'm really excited. This is my final thought. I'm really excited. We've been planning to do this for a really long time, actually. But with life's hectic, unexpected events, we always end up delaying a lot of things. But I always say, everything comes at the right time. So even if we did plan it a while ago and it didn't happen, of course there was a reason. We're very excited to have you on board as well, Tuba, because you're not only expert in the field of psychology, but you have also been part of our internship, right? So also the insights of how we work as well. So that's going to be very, very useful for us as well, and for the listeners. I'm really looking forward to everybody, like you said, sharing their stories, sharing their opinions, questions, and so on. We're very open to that, and we are still in the process of finalizing like our topics. So this is everybody's chance,
Mhm.
to jump in and say, I want to talk about this. I want to hear about this. Our podcast will not be too long, because I know people don't have the patience or time to listen for hours. So it'll be like a maximum 30 minutes or something per podcast. We will have at least one podcast per week that we will be, posting on our social media channels for listeners as well to know. But in general, we'll take it kind of as it comes with our listeners. Like, what do they want to listen to? Of course, we will adapt that more in more detail. So, on a final note, I just want to say I'm very, very excited, and I thank you, Tuba, for hosting this podcast.
Thank you so much. That was really kind of you. So thank you, Dr. Ale, for joining us today. And also to our listeners, we really look forward for all of you to hear and learn, and just cannot wait for you guys to see what's in store. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye bye.